Edit. The strange thing about being abandoned is that people assume the worst part is watching someone walk away from you. They are wrong. The worst part is realizing they already left long before they reached the door. My name is Logan Mercer, and at exactly 11:59 p.m. on a cold October night, I stood on the front porch of the house I had spent 7 years helping build while rain fell from a black sky and collected in shining puddles across the driveway. The porch light cast a warm glow over the wet concrete, making the scene look almost peaceful from a distance. It was not peaceful. It was the moment this conversation had already happened without me. Decisions had already been made. I was simply the last person invited to hear them. Rain tapped against the roof above us. Water dripped from the gutters in steady streams. Somewhere down the street, a car passed slowly through the neighborhood, its headlights briefly sweeping across the houses before disappearing into the darkness. "Logan," Rachel said quietly, "this cannot keep going." I looked at her for a long moment. The woman standing in front of me looked familiar, but somehow distant at the same time. I remembered the first apartment we rented together. I remembered eating pizza on the floor because we could not afford furniture yet. I remembered road trips, late-night conversations, and plans for the future. Those memories felt like photographs from someone else's life. "What exactly cannot keep going?" I asked. Thomas stepped forward before Rachel could answer. "You are 36 years old," he said. "You work hard, and I will give you credit for that. But hard work is not enough. A man needs direction, ambition, a plan." I almost smiled. I had heard versions of that speech for years. At family dinners, at holiday gatherings, during backyard cookouts. It always sounded the same. They measured success with numbers. Bigger houses, newer cars, higher salaries. They never understood why those things mattered less to me than keeping my word. Linda shook her head. "Rachel deserves more stability than this." More stability. The phrase hung in the air between us. Funny, I had never missed a mortgage payment. Never left a bill unpaid. Never walked away when someone needed help. Yet somehow stability was the one thing they believed I lacked. I looked back at Rachel. Part of me expected her to disagree with them. Part of me hoped she would. Instead, she lowered her eyes. "They are right," she said softly. The rain seemed louder after that. I drove for nearly an hour before stopping at a roadside motel just outside Philadelphia. The neon vacancy sign buzzed softly above the parking lot, casting red reflections across the wet pavement. Rain continued falling in thin silver lines beneath the streetlights. I rented the cheapest room available, carried my suitcase inside, and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on a single light. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee. Somewhere beyond the wall, a television played at low volume. For the first time in years, there was nobody asking me to explain myself. Nobody measuring my worth. Nobody questioning my choices. The silence felt strange, but it also felt honest. I leaned back against the headboard and stared at the ceiling. The events of the night replayed themselves again and again. Rachel's expression, Thomas's speech, Linda's disappointment. The suitcase already packed before I arrived. What hurt most was not being asked to leave. It was realizing they had all reached that decision long before I walked through the door. Families do not usually break apart in a single night. They break apart slowly, one assumption at a time, one disappointment at a time, one conversation left unfinished. Looking back, I could see exactly when things started changing. Rachel had not always looked at me with doubt in her eyes. When we first met, she admired simple things. She liked that I showed up when I said I would. She liked that I worked hard. She liked that I kept my promises. Back then, our future felt clear. We rented a small apartment with thin walls and unreliable heating. We shared takeout dinners on folding chairs. We laughed about things that seemed important at the time. Neither of us cared about status. At least I thought we did not. Then life happened. Promotions. New social circles. Comparisons. Rachel began spending more time around people who treated success like a competition. Conversations shifted. Every gathering seemed to revolve around bigger houses, investment portfolios, luxury vacations, and career titles. Slowly, almost invisibly, the standards changed. The things that once mattered became less important. The things that never interested me suddenly became the only things everyone talked about. Thomas never hid his opinions. He believed ambition should always be visible. If someone was not constantly chasing something bigger, he assumed they lacked drive. Linda was more subtle. She wrapped criticism inside concern. She would smile while asking questions designed to expose every perceived weakness in my life. I usually ignored it, not because I lacked answers, because arguing never seemed worth it. The funny thing was that none of them knew how much I actually did. When Thomas needed help repairing storm damage at his lake property, I spent weekends helping him. When Linda needed rides after medical appointments, I adjusted my schedule without complaint. When Rachel wanted to launch her consulting business, I quietly covered extra expenses until she got established. I never mentioned any of it afterward. That was not how I was raised. You help people because they matter, not because you expect applause. Unfortunately, sacrifices made quietly are often forgotten first. Around 2 in the morning, I checked my phone. No calls. No messages. 7 years together, and nobody had asked where I was or whether I had arrived safely. I stared at the dark screen for several seconds before setting it aside. Outside, headlights crossed the parking lot and disappeared again. Rain tapped against the window. Sleep refused to come. Instead, memories filled the room. Some good, some painful, all of them distant now. Eventually, I stood and walked toward the window. The storm had started to weaken. Clouds drifted across the night sky. Somewhere beyond them, dawn was getting closer. I did not know exactly what came next. I only knew that something inside me had changed. For years, I had spent energy trying to be understood by people who had already made up their minds. That chapter was over. What they called a lack of ambition was actually something else entirely. It was a promise I had made long ago to the one man whose opinion mattered most. And before the sun rose over the horizon, that promise was about to change everything. The clock beside the motel bed read 4:51 a.m. when I finally gave up trying to sleep. The storm had almost passed. Only a light drizzle remained, tracing thin lines down the window. The parking lot outside sat quiet beneath pale yellow lamps. A few pickup trucks were parked near the far end of the building. Their wet surfaces reflected the first hints of dawn. I stood by the window holding a paper cup of coffee that tasted more like hot water than coffee and watched the sky slowly brighten. Moments like that have a way of forcing honesty. There was nobody around to impress. Nobody around to disappoint. Just me, the silence, and memories I had spent years keeping private. Most people who met Henry Mercer assumed his life had always been extraordinary. They saw magazine covers, business articles, interviews, and headlines. They saw the billionaire. I saw my grandfather, the man who taught me how to repair a fence line before teaching me how to read a balance sheet. The man who insisted that character mattered more than reputation. The man who believed the easiest way to lose yourself was to let money become your identity. When I was 13 years old, he took me to a ranch property in Montana during summer break. The place stretched for miles beneath open sky. No cameras, no boardrooms, no luxury, just dirt roads, horses, and long days of work. I remember complaining one afternoon while repairing a section of fencing beneath a 100-degree sun. I asked him why someone with his resources bothered doing things the hard way. He laughed and leaned against a fence post. Then he told me something I never forgot. He said wealth can buy comfort, Logan, but it cannot buy respect. Respect has to be earned when nobody knows who you are. At the time, I thought it was simply another lesson. Years later, I realized it was preparation. My parents died when I was young. After that, Henry became the closest thing I had to a father. He could have handed me everything. Instead, he handed me responsibility. As I got older, he gradually introduced me to pieces of the family business. Not the glamorous parts. The difficult parts. Risk, accountability, leadership, consequences. Then, when I turned 25, he made me a promise and asked for one in return. He promised that one day everything he built would pass to me. In return, he wanted me to live independently until that day came. No special treatment. No shortcuts. No using the Mercer name to open doors. Build your own life first, he said. Learn who people are before they learn who you are. I agreed. At the time, it felt simple. Looking back, it became the most important decision of my life. That promise explained everything Rachel never understood. It explained why I drove an older truck, why I kept a modest job, why I never talked about family wealth, why I never corrected assumptions. The truth was that I had spent years proving something to myself. I wanted to know I could stand on my own feet. I wanted every achievement to belong to me rather than a last name. Most importantly, I wanted relationships built on truth instead of opportunity. The motel room grew brighter as morning approached. I set the empty cup on the nightstand and looked at my phone. No messages. No calls. Nothing from Rachel. Nothing from Thomas. Nothing from Linda. Strange how silence can answer questions words never could. I was still staring at the screen when it suddenly vibrated. An unfamiliar New York number appeared. Once. Then again. Then a third time. Something tightened in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. Deep down, I already knew who was calling. I pressed accept and lifted the phone to my ear. A calm professional voice spoke my name. It belonged to Andrew Bennett. And within the next 60 seconds, the promise I made to Henry Mercer would finally come due. Andrew Bennett was not the type of man who called before sunrise unless something mattered. The moment I heard his voice, I knew the day I had spent years preparing for had finally arrived. I stood beside the motel window as dawn spread across the horizon, painting the clouds in pale shades of gold and gray. The parking lot below remained nearly empty. A delivery truck rolled past the entrance and disappeared down the highway. Everything outside looked ordinary. Nothing inside felt ordinary anymore. "Logan," Andrew said carefully, "I wish I were calling under different circumstances." My grip tightened around the phone. Deep down, I already understood what was coming. "It is Henry, isn't it?" Silence filled the line for a brief moment. Then he answered, "Yes. Your grandfather passed away early this morning." The room suddenly felt smaller. The sounds around me faded. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and stared at the worn carpet beneath my feet. Henry Mercer had always seemed larger than life. Not because of his wealth, because of his presence. He was the one person I could call at any hour. The one person who always knew exactly what to say. Even after all these years, some part of me believed he would always be there. I closed my eyes and remembered the last conversation we had shared. He sounded tired but peaceful. Before ending the call, he told me something unusual. He said that every person eventually discovers whether their life was built on appearances or truth. At the time, I assumed it was another lesson. Now I realized it had been a goodbye. "Are you still there?" Andrew asked. "Yes." My voice sounded distant even to me. "What happens now?" Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. Then his tone became more formal. "Your grandfather's succession plan has been activated. Effective immediately, you are designated as the sole heir and primary successor to the Mercer estate and all controlling interests attached to it." I stared at the motel wall without speaking. Even though I had known this day would eventually come, hearing the words spoken aloud felt different. Real. Permanent. Andrew continued. "The board has already been notified. Senior leadership is assembling in Manhattan. They are requesting your presence as soon as possible." I glanced toward the window again. The first rays of sunlight had reached the parking lot. The storm was officially over. "How soon?" I asked. "A private aircraft is waiting for you at Trent Mercer Airport. Departure is scheduled in 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Less than 12 hours earlier, I had been standing in the rain watching the front door of my marriage close behind me. Now a corporate jet was waiting to carry me toward a future I had spent years trying not to think about. Life can change gradually. Then sometimes it changes all at once. Andrew began outlining details. Meetings, briefings, legal reviews, security arrangements, transitional authority documents. Every sentence added another layer of responsibility. Yet through all of it, one thought remained constant. Henry trusted me enough to leave everything in my hands. That mattered more than any number attached to an estate. "There is one final message," Andrew said. "Your grandfather instructed me to deliver it only after this call." I sat up straighter. "What did he say?" The attorney paused. "He said that when this day arrived, you would finally learn who loved you for yourself and who only loved the story they wanted you to become." The words hit harder than anything else that morning. I thought about Rachel. I thought about Thomas and Linda. I thought about the empty phone that had remained silent throughout the night. For years, I had wondered whether my grandfather's lessons were overly cautious. Suddenly, they felt prophetic. I ended the call a few minutes later and stood alone in the motel room. Sunlight spilled across the floor. The same suitcase from the night before rested near the door. Nothing in the room had changed. Yet everything had changed. I picked up my jacket, grabbed the suitcase, and headed for the exit. Somewhere in Manhattan, an empire was waiting. And while I was walking toward a private jet, Rachel still believed I was just another man sitting alone in a cheap motel wondering what to do next. The private terminal was already active when I arrived. Morning sunlight stretched across the tarmac, reflecting off polished aircraft and rows of glass windows. A black SUV waited near the entrance, its engine running quietly. A man in a dark suit stepped forward as I approached and greeted me by name. The experience felt surreal. Less than 12 hours earlier, I had been driving through a rainstorm with nowhere to go. Now people I had never met were opening doors and coordinating schedules around my arrival. I carried the same suitcase through the terminal. That detail stayed with me. The circumstances had changed. The suitcase had not. Maybe that was why it grounded me. The flight to New York lasted less than an hour. Most of it passed in silence. Andrew had forwarded dozens of briefing documents during the drive to the airport. Financial reports, organizational charts, succession plans, summaries prepared months earlier in anticipation of a day everyone knew would eventually arrive. I read carefully, but every few pages my attention drifted toward the window. Clouds rolled beneath the aircraft like an endless white ocean. Somewhere beyond them was the future Henry had spent years preparing me to face. By the time we landed, grief and responsibility had become impossible to separate. A motorcade met us at the airport. Manhattan appeared ahead like a wall of glass rising into the sky. I had visited the city many times with Henry, but this felt different. Every building seemed larger. Every street carried more weight. The headquarters of Mercer Global occupied an entire tower in Midtown. Sunlight reflected off its mirrored exterior. Employees streamed through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups, laptops, and briefcases. Most had no idea who I was. Most had no idea that by the end of the day, their professional future would be linked to mine. The lobby stretched upward through multiple floors of marble, steel, and glass. Digital displays showed market data from around the world. Yet despite the scale, the atmosphere felt focused rather than flashy. Henry always hated unnecessary extravagance. Results mattered more than appearances. That philosophy was visible everywhere. The elevator carried me to the executive level. When the doors opened, conversations immediately stopped. A long conference room stood ahead. Around the table sat board members, senior executives, legal advisors, and division leaders. Some looked exhausted from the events of the morning. Others appeared cautious. A few seemed relieved. Andrew entered beside me and completed formal introductions. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, every person in the room stood. Nobody applauded. Nobody smiled. The gesture was simple and respectful. They were not standing for me. They were standing for Henry, for the legacy he spent decades building. That realization hit harder than any financial number I had seen all day. The meeting lasted for hours. Reports were presented. Questions were asked. Strategies were reviewed. Markets, acquisitions, investments, and long-term planning filled the agenda. Through it all, I kept hearing Henry's voice in my head. Listen before speaking. Learn before leading. Earn trust before expecting it. The advice felt more valuable than any legal document sitting on the table. By late afternoon, Andrew placed several transitional authority documents in front of me. The room grew quiet. A fountain pen rested beside the papers. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, casting long shadows across the conference table. I stared at the documents for several seconds. The same hand that signed a motel registration form that morning was now being asked to accept leadership of a global enterprise. Life had moved so quickly it felt almost impossible to process. Finally, I picked up the pen and signed. No celebration followed. No dramatic reaction. Just quiet acknowledgement from people who understood the significance of the moment. The meeting slowly came to an end. Executives gathered their notes and filed out of the room. I remained seated, staring across the Manhattan skyline as evening approached. For the first time all day, my phone vibrated. I glanced down at the screen. The caller identification displayed a name I had not expected to see so soon. Rachel. The phone vibrated a second time before I answered. For a moment, I simply stared at Rachel's name on the screen. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had watched me leave in the rain without trying to stop me. Now she was calling from hundreds of miles away. Life moves quickly when the truth finally catches up. I pressed accept and lifted the phone to my ear. Hello. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then I heard her breathing. Uneven. Nervous. Nothing like the confidence she had shown the night before. Logan, she asked quietly. Yes. Another pause followed. I stood and walked toward the conference room windows. Manhattan stretched across the horizon beneath the fading afternoon light. Traffic flowed through the streets below. People hurried along sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups. The city continued moving forward, completely unaware that an entirely different world had just collapsed somewhere else. "I saw something on television," Rachel finally said. Her voice sounded distant. "Fragile. There was a news report about Mercer Global. They showed your picture." I remained silent. Not because I wanted to make her uncomfortable, because there was nothing useful to add. The facts were already doing all the talking. By then, every major financial network had begun covering Henry's passing and the transition that followed. Analysts discussed succession plans. Business reporters reviewed the history of Mercer Global. My name appeared in headlines across the country. Information that had remained private for years suddenly belonged to everyone. Rachel took a slow breath. "Why did you never tell me?" The question sounded simple. It was not. I leaned against the glass and looked down at the city. "Tell you what?" I asked. "Logan." Her voice cracked slightly. "You know what I mean." The truth was that I did know. I also knew there was no answer she would find satisfying. "You never asked," I said. Silence filled the line again. Somewhere behind her, I heard another voice. Then another. Thomas and Linda. Their words were muffled, but I recognized them immediately. They were together. Of course they were. The moment the news broke, they probably gathered around the television trying to understand how the man they dismissed had somehow become the center of a story none of them expected. Rachel spoke again. "My parents are here." I almost smiled. I figured. They want to talk to you. Less than a day earlier, they had nothing left to say to me. Now they wanted a conversation. The irony did not escape me. "I am busy," I replied calmly. "Please, Logan." There was genuine emotion in her voice now. Fear, regret, confusion, maybe all three. Everything happened so fast. I looked around the empty conference room. Folders still covered parts of the table. Sunlight reflected off glass buildings outside. My entire life had changed within a single day. Yet somehow I felt calmer than I had in months. "No," I said quietly. "It happened slowly. We just noticed it today." Rachel did not answer. I continued. "The television report did not change who I am. It only changed what you know." The line remained silent. For years, I had imagined conversations like this. Defending myself. Explaining myself. Proving something. Now that the moment had arrived, none of those things seemed necessary. Reality required no assistance from me. Eventually, Rachel spoke again. "Can we meet?" I closed my eyes briefly. Henry's words returned once more. "Learn who people are before they learn who you are." Suddenly, the lesson felt clearer than ever. "Not today," I said. Then I ended the call. The screen went dark. I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked back toward the conference table. Before I reached it, the device vibrated again. Then again. Then again. Message after message appeared across the screen. Rachel, Thomas, Linda, old friends, former colleagues, people who had not contacted me in years. By the time I sat down, there were already more than 20 unread notifications waiting. And every single one came from someone who had ignored me yesterday. The messages continued for days. Every morning, I woke up to new notifications. Every evening, I went to sleep with even more waiting. Some came from people I barely remembered. Others came from people. Meetings filled my calendar from sunrise until evening. I met division leaders, reviewed reports, and listened more than I spoke. Every decision reminded me of something Henry used to say. Leadership is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about being responsible when everyone else looks for direction. The advice stayed with me. Yet no matter how busy the days became, Rachel remained impossible to ignore completely. Her messages changed over time. The first one sounded shocked. The next sounded apologetic. Then came honesty. Real honesty. The kind that usually arrives after people run out of excuses. One evening, after finishing a meeting with senior executives, I sat alone in my office overlooking Manhattan. The city glowed beneath the setting sun. Long shadows stretched between buildings. Traffic crawled through the streets below like ribbons of red and white light. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Rachel. I almost ignored it. Instead, I opened it. There were no explanations this time. No attempts to justify anything. Just a single sentence. "I miss the man who always believed in me." I stared at those words longer than I expected. Not because they changed anything. Because they reminded me of who I used to be. For years, I had supported Rachel's dreams without asking for recognition. I believed in her business when nobody else did. I encouraged her during setbacks. I celebrated victories that had nothing to do with me. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being partners and became spectators in each other's lives. The realization felt sad rather than painful. A few minutes later, my office door opened. My assistant stepped inside carrying a folder. "There is something you should probably know," she said. I looked up. "What is it?" "Rachel Mercer is in New York." For a moment, I said nothing. The city lights reflected across the glass behind me. "How do you know?" I asked. "She contacted reception this morning, then security, then your office. She has been trying to arrange a meeting." I leaned back in my chair. Part of me had expected this eventually. Regret has a way of making people travel long distances. My assistant placed the folder on the desk. Inside were records of calls, messages, and formal requests. Rachel had been persistent, more persistent than I had ever seen her before. "Did she leave a message?" I asked. My assistant nodded. "She said she is not here because of your position. She is here because she needs to speak with you face to face." After she left, I remained alone in the office. Outside, darkness settled over Manhattan. Thousands of windows illuminated the skyline. Somewhere among those lights was a woman who had once been the center of my world. Now she was a stranger carrying memories neither of us could escape. I walked toward the window and looked down at the city below. Henry's final lesson echoed in my thoughts once again. Learn who people are before they learn who you are. The lesson had already taught itself. Still, another thought followed close behind it. Sometimes closure matters just as much as truth. I picked up my phone and stared at Rachel's last message. Then I made a decision. For the first time since leaving that house in the rain, I replied. The message was short. One sentence, one invitation, one final opportunity for two people to say what had never been said. And less than an hour later, Rachel agreed to meet me for dinner overlooking the Hudson River. The restaurant overlooked the Hudson River from a quiet corner of Manhattan, where the city felt distant despite being only a few blocks away. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected hundreds of lights dancing across the dark water. Boats moved slowly in the distance, their outlines softened by the evening haze. I arrived early and chose a table near the glass. Not because I wanted the view, because I wanted a few minutes to think. The last time I sat across from Rachel, we were still pretending our problems could be solved by another conversation. This time felt different. The illusion was gone. The only thing left was truth. At exactly 7 o'clock, Rachel entered the restaurant. For a moment, she stood near the entrance scanning the room. Then her eyes found me. She looked older than she had a few weeks earlier. Not physically, emotionally. Regret has a way of changing people. She walked toward the table slowly and sat down across from me. Neither of us spoke immediately. A server poured water into our glasses and quietly disappeared. Outside, reflections shimmered across the river. Inside, the silence carried years of unfinished conversations. Rachel finally looked up. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." I nodded. "You came a long way." A faint smile appeared before fading almost instantly. "So did you." The comment carried more meaning than either of us needed to explain. We spent the first few minutes discussing simple things. Henry, New York, work, safe subjects, familiar subjects. The kind people use when they are standing at the edge of a difficult conversation and need a moment before stepping forward. Eventually, there were no safe subjects left. Rachel folded her hands together and looked toward the river. I replay that night every day. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear the weight behind it. I keep trying to figure out when everything started going wrong. I listened without interrupting. For years, I had imagined defending myself during a moment like this. Instead, I found myself simply listening. Rachel continued. "I used to think success was supposed to look a certain way. Bigger houses, bigger opportunities, bigger everything. Somewhere along the line, I started measuring people the same way." She looked directly at me. "Including you." There was no excuse hidden inside the statement. No attempt to shift responsibility. Just honesty. That alone made the conversation different from everyone that came before it. We talked for nearly an hour. About mistakes. About expectations. About the small moments that slowly pushed us apart without either of us noticing. The city outside continued glowing beneath the night sky, while two people examined the ruins of a life they once planned to share forever. Finally, Rachel asked the question I knew had been waiting all evening. "Is there any chance we can start over?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Hope and fear existed together inside those words. For a moment, I looked out at the river. Then I looked back at her. I reached into the leather portfolio resting beside my chair. Rachel's eyes followed the movement. I saw hope flicker across her face. Not because she knew what was inside. Because she believed the answer might still be yes. Slowly, I removed a document and placed it on the table between us. The restaurant remained quiet. The river remained calm. Yet everything changed in that moment. Rachel lowered her eyes to the page. I watched understanding arrive before the words fully registered. Legal documents. Finalized paperwork. Signatures already completed. Decisions already made. The realization settled across her expression like a shadow. She looked up at me. When? She asked softly. The week after I left. Her eyes closed briefly. Not in anger. Not in disbelief. In acceptance. She finally understood something important. This dinner had never been about rebuilding a marriage. It had been about ending one with dignity. The hope she carried into the restaurant slowly disappeared. In its place came something quieter. Reality. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, the Hudson continued moving toward the ocean. Inside, the future we once imagined finally drifted away with it. Rachel sat quietly for several seconds after looking at the documents. The lights from the Hudson shimmered across the restaurant windows, casting soft reflections across the table between us. Neither of us reached for the paperwork again. There was nothing left to negotiate. Nothing left to explain. Some endings arrive with arguments. Others arrive with understanding. This one arrived with silence. Eventually, Rachel folded her hands together and looked at me. There were tears in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. I really thought there would be another chance. I nodded slowly. I know. She lowered her gaze. The hardest part is realizing I did this to myself. For the first time since I had known her, there was no defensiveness in her words. No excuses. No attempt to blame circumstances, pressure, or other people. Just honesty. Strange how honesty often arrives after consequences. We sat there for a while longer talking about things that no longer needed to be hidden. We talked about where we went wrong. We talked about expectations. We talked about all the moments that seemed small at the time, but slowly changed the direction of our lives. Looking back, neither of us could point to a single day when everything broke. It happened gradually. One misunderstanding, one assumption, one disappointment at a time. Finally, Rachel stood. The city lights reflected in her eyes as she offered a sad smile. I hope you find happiness, Logan. I believe she meant it. I hope you do too, I replied. She nodded once and walked away. I watched until she disappeared beyond the restaurant entrance. Then I turned back toward the river. That was the last time I saw her. Not because I hated her. Not because I wanted revenge. Simply because some chapters are meant to end. A few months later, the legal process concluded quietly. No public drama. No courtroom battles. Just paperwork, signatures, and closure. Rachel returned home and began rebuilding her life. Thomas and Linda eventually sent letters apologizing for the way they had treated me. Real letters. Handwritten. Honest. I replied respectfully. Carrying bitterness forever never seemed like a victory. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means refusing to let the past control your future. As for Mercer Global, the company continued moving forward. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities, new responsibilities. I made mistakes. I learned from them. I grew into the role Henry believed I could handle long before I believed it myself. Sometimes I would stand in my office overlooking Manhattan and think about that rainy night when I drove away from the only life I thought I would ever have. At the time, it felt like everything was ending. In reality, something else was beginning. The greatest lesson from all of this had nothing to do with money. It had nothing to do with success. It had nothing to do with headlines or business empires. The real lesson was much simpler. The people who only recognize your value after discovering your status never truly recognized your value at all. The people who stand beside you when you have nothing are the ones worth holding on to. Henry understood that. It was the reason he asked me to make that promise years ago. He wanted me to learn who people were before they learned who I was. Looking back now, I understand exactly why. Sometimes the most important truths reveal themselves only after everything familiar falls apart. And now I would love to know what you think. If you were in my position, would you have given Rachel another chance? Or do you believe some decisions cannot be undone once they are made? Share your thoughts because every perspective tells a different story. And if stories about resilience, character, loyalty, and life-changing decisions speak to you, consider following along for more journeys like this. You never know which story might remind you of your own. As for me, I finally learned something worth more than any inheritance. Never measure your value by the way others see you. Measure it by the person you remain when nobody is watching.